everyone. Inshallah, we're going to be continuing, inshallah, the tafsir for Surah Nisa today. And certainly, we've actually been working on tafsir Surah Nisa for quite a while. So we're really enjoying this tafsir. And right now, last time we actually did وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا بِاللَّهِ وَرُسُلِهِ وَلَمْ يُفَرِّقُوا بَيْنَ أَحَدٍ مِّنْهُم. Did we leave off here? No, we left off in تُبْدُوا خَيْرًا أَوْ تُخْفُوهُ أَوْ تَعْفُوا عَنْ سُوءٍ فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ عَفُوًّا قَدِيرًا. This is where we left off at. And we did actually go in lots of details. Let's see right there. So we've got Surah An-Nisa and certainly Tafsir Surah Al-Qurtubi as well. And let's go. We just go to Tafsir Surah Al-Qurtubi right there. Here we go. And we went in details with the words of makhul. This is what we actually did. We went into the words of makhul, and we said makhul is a very important scholar, and that he was originally from Afghanistan. And we also said that he had said, quote, there are four different traits. If you have these traits, they're basically for you. They're, in other words, bringing back the good for you. And there are three traits that if they're in you, that they're actually coming back at you. The four traits, number one, in where shukr, al-iman, al-du'a, and al-istighfar, these traits, if they're in you, they're going to be bringing a blessing onto you. They're going to be affecting you, affecting your behavior. They're going to be bringing it at you. Al-shukr, being thankful. Faith, al-iman. Al-du'a is du'a, basically invocation. And al-istighfar is asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness. And there are four traits, if they are, or three traits that are, if they are in you, they're basically going to be, well, actually four traits. If they're in you, أربعة من كنا فيه كنا له وثلاثة من كنا فيه كنا عليه. So three traits, if they're in you, they're basically coming back at you. And the four traits that will be coming at you are basically plotting, oppression, and nakth is corruption. So we did actually go in details with that based on the ayat. So I'm not going to go in more details with that. And we also talked about what it means to not announce evil. And we said to not announce evil simply means that a person is not announcing evil behavior, is not announcing evil words, unless the person is oppressed. And we said there are differences of opinions between scholars, whether this is talking about the person seeking support, or whether this is speaking about the person actually making the dua, or this is talking about a person announcing certain abuse that they might have actually went through, and they are seeking some form of an apology or correction, etc. So in other words, something of a less degree. We went in details about that and how they basically interpreted this ayah based on these different interpretations. And we also talked about in details in terms of how the Prophet ﷺ was also making dua on the kafirin, or at least making dua on those that had done transgression or abused him. And we also talked about certain differences in terms of the munafiqeen compared to the kuffar and what that entails. And we also talked about the dhalam here, whether it's words of abuse or whether it's an action of abuse. And at the end of the day, we said seeking help is not seeking help in where it's a ventilation, but we said seeking help in terms of finding the resources to stop the abuse. in order to stop the abuse. And we also went in details in regards to seeking help. And we talked about whether it's medical help, whether it's psychological help, and whether it's legal help, or even social help. We talked about that. And we mentioned some of the conditions in where many might actually misuse it and think that in order to speak about some of this is basically to ventilate. So we went in details in that regards. Now, the other part in where إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يَكْفُرُونَ بِاللَّهِ وَرُسُلِهِ, that is rather a shift in the ayat. Let's see. So after talking about, and that's what I prepared for today. So after talking about all the different details in terms of how, okay, here we go. What do you do this? Sorry about that, everyone. I'm trying to see the other screen to show it to you. And now I'm lost. It's not allowing me. All right. So after speaking about certain things, and of course, لا يحب الله الجهر بالسوء من القول إلا من ظلم. This is basically in response to the munafiqeen, and we mentioned in details of how they're actually coherent and related to the different ayat that we were doing, simply because القوامة, of course, بالقسط الشهادة, and how, of course, we're speaking about people being witnesses and they're being honest to their witnesses. We mentioned these parts of it. And then it kind of gives a jump. إن الذين يكفرون بالله ورسله ويريدون أن يفرقوا بين الله ورسله ويقولون نؤمن ببعض ونكفر بعض ويريدون أن يتخذوا بين ذلك سبيلا أولئك هم الكافرون حقا وأعتدنا للكافرين عذابا مهينا. Now there's one thing. Last lecture, we said that there is a certain pattern in the Quran in where it lays out a certain behavior, and then it takes us into realizing the cause and effect, the behavior and what that is leading into. And then certainly by putting these 2 points together, it would basically let you recognize how your behavior, whether you're basically contributing in good or whether you are causing the wrong effect that's coming at you later. And right there, of course, when you're looking at these words, it's really important to see where it kind of gives you a shift, but at the same time, it's actually a pattern. Let me do two things here. What we're going to do, I'm going to translate just a roughly, and again, wrong translation. And what I mean by wrong translation, not that it's a purposely wrong translation. What I mean by that is a surface translation for a first time reader, for a first time glance. Even if the person is Arabi, the first time glance, this is how they're going to see the words until we dig deep inside to really unearth those meanings to go farther. So let's just go over. They're going to be 2 pages, so bear with me. إن الذين يكفرون بالله ورسله, those that would deny Allah Almighty and His prophets, and they intend to differentiate or separate between Allah and His Messenger, and they would say, we believe in some, that is some prophets, and we would deny others, that is other prophets, and they would want to take that as a way, basically, and as a path for them, as a path of success, or as a path of claiming that it would probably get them into getting a pass with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Those are the true disbelievers, where the Lord Almighty had prepared for the disbelievers عذاب مهينة, a humiliating torment. And those that would believe in Allah and His Messenger and do not differentiate between any of them, those are the ones that Allah Almighty would grant them their reward. And the Lord Almighty is all forgiving, all merciful. They ask you, that is Ahlul Kitab, the people of the book, to reveal a book or bring a book from the skies. They had asked Musa even far worse than that, far bigger than that. They had asked to see the Lord Almighty in open. And then the الصاعقة, or the blasting sounds of hurricanes, they came at them for the transgression that they had committed. And later they had taken the calf after him, and after all the different details had come to them, and we had forgiven them for it, and we had given Musa great clear powers. We're going to talk about what that means. And we had put up right above them the mountain for, of course, bimithaqihim, with the bond that they were ordered to follow. And we had told them to get into the door while prostrating, and we told them not to transgress on Saturday, and the Lord Almighty had taken upon them a strong bond. And for going against that bond, and for disbelieving in the verses of the Lord Almighty, and killing the prophets with no right, and saying that their hearts are sealed, but the Lord Almighty, as a matter of fact, had actually sealed them because of their disbelief, so they would not believe unless it is rarely believing. And for the disbelief and the denial and the words on Virgin Mary or on Maryam, all the great blasphemy that they had claimed, and their words that they had killed the Messiah or the Messiah, Isa ibn Maryam, Isa the son of Mary, the prophet of the Lord Almighty. And they had not killed him, they had not crucified him, but he was actually shubbiha lahum. It was brought to a blur to them. They were manipulated, that is. And those that had been in dispute in regards to him were in complete skepticism. ما لهم به من علم. They had no knowledge except a following doubt, and they were not sure that they had actually killed him. For the Lord Almighty had risen him to himself, and the Lord Almighty is self-efficient and all-wise. And from the people of the book, they would, before the judgment day, of course, they would believe in him before his death. And on judgment day, he would be a witness on them. For because of the oppression and the transgression of the Jews, they were prevented and prohibited from a lot of good things that were permissible and permitted for them to consume, and for turning people away from the path of the Lord Almighty at many times, and for for them taking interest when they were prevented and prohibited from doing so, and taking the wealth of other people with no right to do so. And the Lord Almighty had prepared for al-kafirin a painful torment. Yet those that are deep in knowledge of them and of the believers, they would believe in the Lord Almighty, they would believe in what was revealed onto you and what was revealed onto the ones before you, and they would perform the prayer, and those that would give zakah, those that would give in charity, and those that would believe in the Lord Almighty, judgment day, those are the ones that the Lord Almighty would give them a magnificent reward. We had revealed unto you as we had revealed unto Noah and the prophets before you. Noah is Noah. And we had revealed unto Abraham, Ishmael, Ishaq, Isaac, Yaqub, Jacob, Al-Asbat, the Israelites, the children of Israel, wa Isa, in Jesus, Ayub is Genoa, ويونس, no, Yunus is Genoa, Ayub is Harun, let's move on. Harun, Aaron, Sulaiman, Solomon, Atayna, Dawood, Zabura, and given Prophet Dawood the Psalms. And many prophets that we had mentioned the stories upon you before, and different messengers that we did not mention their stories upon you. And for the Lord Almighty had talked directly to Musa, different prophets that had come with glad tidings and giving warnings so that people would not have an excuse after the prophets delivering the message. And the Lord Almighty is self-efficient and all-wise. For the Lord Almighty is a witness on what he had revealed upon you. He had revealed it with his knowledge, and the angels are witnesses that it was revealed. And the Lord Almighty is to suffice that he is the witness of such revelation. Those that would disbelieve and those that would turn away from the path of the Lord Almighty had gone into a magnificent delusion. Those that would disbelieve and those that would transgress, the Lord Almighty would not forgive them and would not guide them to the right path, except the path of hellfire, while they would live there eternally. And that is easy on your Lord. O people, the Lord Almighty had sent you the prophet with truth from your Lord Almighty. So believe, it is better for you. And if you are to disbelieve, so know that the Lord Almighty owns everything that is on the earth, on the skies and on the earth. And the Lord Almighty is all-knowing and all-wise. O people, O you people of the book, do not لا تغلوا في دينكم. Do not be in extremism in your faith, and do not say upon the Lord Almighty but the truth. For the Christ, Isa ibn Maryam, Jesus the son of Mary, is the prophet of the Lord Almighty, and his word was revealed unto Maryam and a spirit from him. So believe in Allah and his messenger, and do not say and speak of Trinity. End it. It is better for you. For it is that the Lord Almighty is one God, that there is no one like unto him. How does he have a child when he owns everything that is on the earth and everything that is on the skies and everything that is on the earth? And it is enough to depend on Allah Almighty. Christ would not deter away from being the servant of the Lord Almighty, neither would the angels that are near to the Lord Almighty. For whoever turns away from worshiping the Lord Almighty and would be in arrogance, the Lord Almighty would combine all of them to him. As for those that are in belief and do what is righteous, for the Lord Almighty would give them their reward and increase with his own blessings. And for those that would deter away and be in arrogance, for the Lord Almighty would punish them with a painful punishment, and they would not find away from the Lord Almighty any support and any victory. Looking at these words, of course, it kind of shifted a couple things. It kind of shifted, but then you might be confused as well. We were going in certain details in regards to understanding justice and trying to break it down in terms of social justice. Then we went into certain descriptions of al-munafiqeen. Then we went into certain descriptions of Ahl al-Kitab. How did we get into all of this? Now, a couple things. There's no way. What it wanted to get to was there's no way that you can get to understanding justice if you don't have your definition and your resources for determining and defining justice actually coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For if your place of justice is really determined whether a human resource, or whether it's speculation, or whether it's basically your own feelings, then what you're going to find yourself really going into is injustice without you realizing. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically taking us into recognizing, number one, our resources, and number two, the different behaviors and what that is actually leading to. But it's important to mention that in the Quran, it would tell you the stories of the prophets, not in order for you, well, I've got a story so that for me to listen to, how fun. Absolutely not. It is telling you the stories for the prophets for a couple reasons. Number one, it's mentioning the stories of the prophets to consider, number one, as a miracle in order for the people that are listening, and especially Ahlul Kitab, who have some revelation where they could go back to some resources, they could go back to certainly verify certain information. With this, of course, the Prophet ﷺ being illiterate, this is a prophet that is illiterate coming with such information. How did he get such information? So verifying the miracle, that's number one. And that's why the stories that were mentioned are actually within the Arabian Peninsula, and not stories that were mentioned probably about prophets that probably lived in India or China or who knows where, because there's no way that they can verify such stories, because they're anyways happening somewhere that they have no access to. So that's why all the prophets that were mentioned in the Quran are really within the Arabian Peninsula, within, of course, their reach to verify, their reach to research. That's number one. And number two, when we're speaking about the stories, it is in order to tell us that this is how the story began. How does the story continue? How do you continue the story? And of course, seeing the cause and effect on us, on the behavior, and certainly seeing the cause and effect comes not only in seeing cause and effect in terms of behavior, but also verifying the result on the long run and the short run. So the long run and the short run. How are you going to be seeing that? Because studying history is a aqeedah. Keep that in mind. Studying history is aqeedah. There's no way that you can actually understand your aqeedah if you don't see its history and what actually happened to it. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions a lot of the story of the prophets in order to tell you the history of Iman, the history of the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what really happened to it. How did we get into this kind of delusion that people are living in? How did it go that far? What happened? What kind of contribution, good contribution, or what kind of an influence and manipulation did people have to let the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually change into a completely different interpretation, a completely different religion? How did we go that far? Can this happen to the Muslims as well? Certainly it can. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would actually tell us those sides in how it can actually bring about the effect. So what I did was actually look at these words, and I saw one certain pattern. Let me share the screen right there. I looked into the words and I thought, well, let me do one thing. I wanted to look at the different groups that these ayat were laying out, that is. So the different groups were, number one, let's look at them. You got الذين كفروا, you got المؤمنين, and you also have certain munafiqeen as well, in where it basically mentioned it. And then I took the verbs. So I would take each and every single verb, and of course, what description it wanted to lay out. And this is what I came up with. I'm going to show you this little tiny map that I put up. Here we go. Taking in, of course, here we go. So I took in order in where it was talking about al-Iman and talking about the implication and the impact of al-Iman. And it would talk about al-Nifaq and the implication of Nifaq and what they did and what that actually resulted in. Al-Kufr, what they did and what that resulted in. Now, this is extremely important to look at because it's kind of hard if you don't lay it out and just read the words. They kind of go over each other. And what we're trying to do is really, let's say, try to go deep inside and trying to see what the words are saying. So let's take it one by one. In where before that, of course, it was talking about, here we go. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تتخذوا الكافرين أولياء من دون المؤمنين أتوا إن المنافقين, where to go? Okay, here we go. So basically right there in where it was talking about إن المنافقين يخادعون الله وهو خادعهم وإذا قاموا إلى الصلاة قاموا كسالى. We talked about the munafiqeen. We're not going to go in details more again. With that, يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تتخذوا الكافرين أولياء من دون المؤمنين. So let's go ahead and actually look at this right there in where what happened. المؤمنين, of course, we talked about that before. النفاق, hypocrisy, in where they would take the disbelievers as a source of authority, determination, and support. What is the impact? Not having the forgiveness. Adam al-maghfirah. Let's continue with the ayah. We're going to take it one by one. Okay, let's continue with the ayah right there. In where? إن المنافقين. So what was the impact? Basically في الدرك الأسفل من النار. Let's continue right there. And إن الذين يكفرون بالله ورسله ويريدون أن يفرقوا بين الله ورسله ويقولون نؤمن ببعض ونكفر ببعض ويريدون أن يتخذوا بين ذلك سبيلا أولئك هم الكافرون حقا. Let's go ahead and let's actually look at that. In where الكفر, basically what did it cause? It basically caused ازدادوا كفرا. It basically made them increase in al-kufr, made them increase in al-kufr, and they ended up basically being in delusion. Let's see, is that how we actually see in this ayah, in where ازدادوا كفرا, and then they basically went into الضلال. They basically went into الضلال. And let's see, I'm going to show you those ayat just to make sure to help you actually connect with those ayat and not get lost. Okay, here we go. So I want you to see these and correlate these words. Here we go. So إن الذين آمنوا ثم كفروا ثم آمنوا ثم كفروا ثم ازدادوا كفرا لم يكن له ليغفر لهم ولا ليهديهم سبيلا. What is the impact? So let's see. Let's go back right there. In where, what did they do? So basically, al-kufr. They increased in kufr. And we said to increase in kufr is to increase and go deep in what leads the person to kufr. What is the effect on that? What is the effect on these people? Basically falling in delusion. Let's continue. In where? Let's continue with the ayat right there. Continue with the ayat. الذين يتخذون الكافرين أولياء من دون المؤمنين. Let's go over there. We're going to come back. We're going to keep on going. يتخذون الكافرين أولياء من دون المؤمنين. They would take the disbelievers as source of authority. الأولياء, الولي, source of authority, source of determination or decision making, and support and victory. What is the impact that's going to basically cause on their life? That where they're not going to be forgiven. Let's see. Let's go back to the ayat again. What happens? أيبتغون عندهم العزة فإن العزة لله جميعا. What is the impact? Let's look at it right there. Here we go. What happens? Well, they're actually seeking honor elsewhere. What is the effect? فقدان الهداية. They basically lost guidance because they were seeking it from the wrong place. They were seeking authority from the wrong place. They were seeking decision making from the wrong place. They were seeking support from the wrong place. So what did they basically lead themselves into? They basically lost the support of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They basically lost their honor, lost the support of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they found themselves really depending on themselves. We went in details in regard to that. And let's continue right there. وقد نزل عليكم في الكتاب أن إذا سمعتم آيات الله يكفر بها ويستهزأ بها فلا تقعدوا معهم حتى يخوضوا في حديث غيره. Let's look at the munafiqeen, the behavior. What is it? The behavior was they would listen to the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being mocked at, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling them not to listen to such words because they would basically be considered as part of them. So what were they doing? They were basically engaging in the mockery, not in words, but in just being present. So what is the effect? Well, the Lord Almighty basically said that He would combine them with جَامِعُ الْمُنَافِقِينَ وَالْكَافِرِينَ فِي جَهَنَّمَ جَمِيعًا. He would basically gather all the munafiqeen, all the kafirin together in hellfire. So what does that really mean? That would basically mean they would become part of them. So what does that also entail? That basically entails that if a person is participating even in just adding a number, that basically means the person is becoming a part of such a group in this dunya, and then in the akhirah they would be a part of such a group in the akhirah as well. Let's continue with trying to scrutinize these ayat. Let's go further. And الذين يتربصون بكم فإن كان لكم فتح من الله قالوا ألم نكن معكم. And if, of course, they would be with the munafiqeen. They would be the munafiqeen would be with the kuffar. They would basically say that they were somehow doing their role in supporting the disbelievers against the believers, and that they were somehow weakening the Muslims from feeling, or at least giving and getting the inspiration of strength and victory. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says He would be the one to actually rule in them. Let's continue right there in where what happened to the munafiqeen. We went in details in where they're basically in delusion, and of course they would take al-awliya, so the wrong awliya, and we did actually put it right there. So for al-izza, for al-wilaya, for all of these different details, we did actually mention it right there. So let's see, for al-mu'mineen, on the other hand, let's go over there in where for المؤمنين إلا الذين تابوا وأصلحوا واعتصموا بالله وأخلصوا دينهم لله. So those that would repent, they would act in and engage in piety, and they would be consistent with the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and have sincerity. Those would be with the mu'mineen. So now it's talking about the mu'mineen. وَسَوْفَ يُؤْتِ اللَّهُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ أَجْرًا عَظِيمًا. Let's put that within our boxes right there. So for al-iman, what do they get? Well, the fi'l, the act was that they actually believed. What did they find? Well, they found guidance. Let's see, what else? They basically had engaged in salah and zakah. It basically brought them forgiveness. Let's continue right there. So trying to see those actions. لا يحب الله الجهر بالسوء من القول إلا من ظلم إن الذين يكفرون بالله ورسله ويريدون أن يفرقوا بين الله ورسله ويقولون نؤمن بعض ونكفر بعض. Here's the dangerous one. Let's look at that. So what happened? So for al-kafirin, ازدادوا كفرا, their increased behavior in turning away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that brought them into a distant level. They brought them into a delusion. All right, and certainly this is right there still within kufr. Let's continue with أهل الكتاب. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes us to أهل الكتاب to realize what did they do. يفرقوا بين الله ورسله. They distinct or differentiated between Allah and His Messenger. In other words, they said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't reveal anything. We believe in God, but not necessarily the Prophet. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would right there basically say that He would ever differentiate and regard that no, it's one way and not the other, and therefore consider that the revelation had been sent down onto certain prophets but deny other prophets. And that's why they would say we would believe in certain prophets but not all prophets, and they would consider that is going to basically take them in into a path of finding guidance. So let's see, what does that actually mean? So let's say they basically had been later on engaging in falling into the delusion in where such a delusion made them leave practicing the Sharia. Let's see. In where? Let's see. What did they do? والذين آمنوا بالله ورسله ولم يفرقوا بين أحد منهم أولئك سوف يؤتيهم أجورهم وكان الله غفورا رحيما. Those that don't differentiate between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his prophet, and they would not consider or deny one prophet and believe in another, those are the ones that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would give them their reward. And they would, the people of the book, that is the Yahud, they said in order to believe in the Prophet ﷺ, they basically wanted the Prophet ﷺ right before their eyes to actually be carried up to bring about a revelation from the skies right before their eyes. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, well, they actually asked for something even worse than that. So what is it? Is it wrong to ask for a miracle? Let's see, is it wrong to ask for a miracle? What was the reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually stated that they had asked Musa for something far worse than that? Now, the word akbar, yes, it means bigger, but this is a metaphor within this context to mean that they had asked something far worse, far more dangerous. What is the danger of that act to actually ask to see Allah? Well, they didn't necessarily want to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just to get the blessings of seeing Allah. No, they actually wanted to find different ways to mock the Prophet Musa alayhi salam, to say, well, you don't have any evidence. That's because they wanted to deny all the displayed evidence in before their eyes, where the Prophet Musa alayhi salam, where Prophet Musa alayhi salam had basically displayed in front of them. So they weren't seeking to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as for a blessing, but it was as for an arrogance. It was a type of mockery. It was a way to say that even if you were to bring the Lord himself, we're not going to actually believe in all of that. And they basically referred it as a form of legend, as nothing but a myth. And certainly they were basically wanting to reject it despite all the evidence displayed onto them. Even if the Lord himself had appeared to them, they would be in disbelief. All right. So this is why this ayah right there saying akbara min dhalik, in order to say that such people were not really seeking faith, they were actually seeking arrogance. They weren't seeking faith, they were seeking arrogance. Same thing when the people of the book, specifically the Yahud, when they had actually asked a revelation of the book, they weren't seeking a revelation as much as they were seeking arrogance. They were seeking a way to basically say, we're going to ask for the impossible in order to basically tell you that it is impossible for us to believe in all of this. And let's see, what happened to them when they actually did that? When they were living the arrogance, let's go back to our little chart right there. When they lived the arrogance, let's say that basically resulted in naqd al-mithaq. What is naqd al-mithaq? Naqd actually means to turn away from, to corrupt, to basically to oppose. So il-mithaq is basically a convent. In other words, it's a bond, it's a convent in where you're basically holding on to it. So what this is metaphorically really here meaning is leaving practicing Sharia. So what was that bond, the principle? What were they supposed to hold on to? Well, this is basically the Sharia, the principles of the Lord Almighty. That's what they turned away from. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically tell us that the result was, let's say, they were basically going through different stages of turning away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Number one, they asked for what they had asked for in terms of seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala out of arrogance. And then, of course, the result was, what page are you seeing? The result was أخذتهم الصاعقة. The result was they actually were taken from a sa'iqa, which basically is a blasting sound. The word sa'iqa means a blasting sound, but this is not a blasting sound alone. But this is some form of a disaster, a natural disaster, what we would call a natural disaster that basically had affected them in where it basically killed them. And what was the reason for that? That was as a result of dhulm, as a result of oppression. Why were they considered oppressors? For what? They, just by going against the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that would basically mean the person is an oppressor, just by going against the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. ثم اتخذوا العجل من بعد ما جاءتهم البينات. What did they get? Well, they received the clear message. They were seeking, or so they claimed, that they were in search of clear evidence to prove Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to prove the revelation. But then when they got it, yes, at one point they turned back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but then Prophet Musa alayhi salam was granted sultanan mubina, was granted more of power, more of clear power. And Sultan Mubin is here to refer to the different miracles that Prophet Musa alayhi salam had come with. Despite all the different miracles that he had come with, part of them was basically when the mountain was lifted above their heads. And certainly when they were asked again to prostrate and enter the doors of Palestine, of course, while they're prostrating, and when they were ordered not to transgress and fish on Saturday, but of course they were given all these. That's why we said al-mithaq al-ghalidh. We said it was practicing Sharia. Let's go back to it. Let's go back to our point right there. In where number one, in where al-mithaq al-ghalidh, it was the convent, basically that metaphor in order to refer to practicing Islam itself, practicing the principles of the Lord Almighty. So when you see al-mithaq al-ghalidh in the Quran is actually mentioned in 3 different cases. Bear with me. Number one, al-mithaq al-ghalidh is mentioned as the strong bond between Allah and the prophets. Number two, the strong bond of principle. How do you maintain a strong bond between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? It's basically by hanging on to the principles of the Lord Almighty. Number three, al-mithaq al-ghalidh, the strong bond between the husband and the wife. That's al-mithaq al-ghalidh. The word al-mithaq and al-ghalidh are 2 words. Al-mithaq actually means convent, actually means an agreement. Al-ghalidh actually means thick, strong. So al-mithaq al-ghalidh, a strong bond, a strong agreement, a strong, or let's say a fused relationship, in where if a person, let's take it one by one now. If we're looking at prophets and messengers, it's a strong bond in where they were basically asked to reveal the message. That was a strong bond between the prophets and the prophets and messengers and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That was a strong bond. It was basically a bond between them and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even about Prophet Musa alayhi salam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had spoken to Musa directly. Let's see. The second strong bond would basically be between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How does that strong bond actually build up? It builds up and it becomes strong when the person is basically holding on to the principle of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What if the person leaves that strong bond? Let's see. Let's go right there and actually see the words. Here we go. فَبِمَا نَقْضِهِمْ مِيثَاقَهُم. Here's the cause and effect again. Cause and effect. When they had rejected and left the strong bond and denied the verses of the Lord Almighty, and they had killed the prophets with no right, and they had said, our hearts are sealed, for the truth of the matter is that the Lord Almighty had sealed their hearts because of their denial, and they would rarely believe. Let's go back to our, right there, little chart. Let's see. So what happened? Let's see. These are three things. Number one, talked about نقض الميثاق. نقض الميثاق, leaving practicing the principles of the Lord Almighty. What is the effect on them? Let's look at it. طبع الله على قلوبهم. What is the effect? The effect. So they left a strong bond, they killed the prophets, and they said that three things that they had done. They said their hearts are sealed. In other words, they can't, their hearts are completely sealed from absorbing such evidence that the prophets and the messengers had come with a revelation. In other words, we're not ready to hear that. And their hearts basically not accepting whatsoever any evidence, not even a word that is putting any strong evidence to support their argument. So what was the impact? Let's see. Let's go back to our chart right there. Let's see. نقض الميثاق طبع الله على قلوبهم. When they had left practicing the principle Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what happened? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sealed their hearts. In other words, when the person chooses to distance themselves away from applying the principles or Sharia, what they will find themselves into, really putting themselves, that their hearts would actually be sealed. Little by little, they'll find themselves distancing away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Well, it's exactly like how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually said, كَلَّا بَلْ رَانَ عَلَى قُلُوبِهِمْ مَا كَانُوا يَكْسِبُونَ. Exactly like how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in Surah al-Mutaffifin, verily, what had actually caused their hearts to be in such a state, كَلَّا بَلْ رَانَ عَلَى قُلُوبِهِمْ. Their hearts were rusted, عَلَى قُلُوبِهِمْ, their hearts were rusted, بِمَا كَانُوا يَكْسِبُونَ, because of what they had done, because what they had committed. In other words, what a person commits is basically going to be what is remaining onto their hearts. Let's continue. قتل الأنبياء. Why did they kill the prophets? بغير حق. Is there such a thing as killing a prophet with right? No. This is in order to emphasize that they had killed the prophets in order to find a way to silence the truth. To silence the truth, to silence the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What is the result? لا يؤمنون إلا قليلا. They would barely believe. What is لا يؤمنون إلا قليلا? Barely believe as an individual? No. Very few people. In other words, it didn't just affect the individual, but it even affected the society. In other words, when you're looking at sin, leaving the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it goes farther than the individual, affecting even the society. لا يؤمنون إلا قليلا. Affecting the society, affecting the individuals, and certainly not only affecting society and individuals, but affecting later generations as well. What happened? They said, قلوبنا غلف. They thought that that was going to show some form of knowledge, some form of hierarchy and knowledge, but the truth of the matter, it basically resulted in their hearts really not seeing the truth, and that basically took them away from seeing haqq. Let's continue with this ayat in order to see, where it's taking us. وَبِكُفْرِهِمْ وَقَوْلِهِمْ عَلَى مَرْيَمَ بُهْتَانًا عَظِيمًا. So that basically led them to what happened. Well, that they had basically denied and even used a narrative. I want to look at this one. So their hearts were sealed Then they started creating a new narrative. I want you to look at it. Their hearts were sealed from absorbing the truth, from taking in the truth. So what did they invent? They invented a new narrative. So they denied it, and then they created a narrative on Maryam, and that narrative, it was a great blasphemy. So what happened? Not only did the behavior distance them, izdadu kufra. Let's look at it again right there. So your behavior or the behavior itself basically takes the person into a delusion. It basically seals their heart, and they would find themselves not finding any door or any pathway to belief. And then what ends up with creating a new narrative, in where the new narrative right there takes the person into kufr, takes the person into kufr. What is that related in Surah Nisa? Well, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us, in the same way that Ahlul Kitab had created a new narrative on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the same way in where a person can actually go into a delusion and find themselves as leaving al-mithaq, leaving the principles of the Lord Almighty. They will find that their hearts cannot absorb the truth, and that would affect the society. Very few people would engage in justice, and what they would engage in where they would go in ittiba' al-dhann. They'll start creating different ways that they will give it a name of theory, they will give it a name philosophy, they will give it different gender studies, women's studies, all these different psychology, etc. They'll give it different names, and of course all of it is really based on ittiba' al-dhann. It's really based on speculation, and what that gets them into is losing al-yaqeen, losing certainty. Why? Because that would only take them into more and more ikhtilaf, dispute, trying to understand the different data that they got. But then if they don't actually have the resource in place, their resources in place, what they're going to be getting into is more and more distanced in finding the truth, and they're going to find themselves in more dispute. They're going to find themselves in more dhann and shak, more doubt, and certainly loss of ilm. They're going to find themselves in more doubt, in more skepticism, in loss of certainty and knowledge. And what that will lead to is basically dhulm and injustice. When they practice dhulm and injustice, they're going to find themselves really losing a lot of tayyibat, a lot of the good things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted to give them, a lot of the good things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted them to enjoy, a lot of the good things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted them to embrace, because that was going to be bringing them the pleasure, that was going to be bringing them the stability within the society, within themselves, that was going to be bringing them into a way in how to enjoy this dunya. So what did that actually result in? That resulted in, of course, getting them into as-sadd an sabilillah. And certainly let's go back to the ayat right there to really see how we got this far. So they created a narrative that Isa alayhi salam was actually killed when they put in an effort to silence the truth before they killed the different prophets. And that now they tried to create a new narrative, a new way to silence the truth. And they basically tried to kill Prophet Isa alayhi salam. But the truth of the matter, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, he was not actually killed, but they confused the wrong person. They took a disciple, they confused him with another person, and then they went into shak, idhan. I want you to look at these words. اختلفوا فيه. They went into dispute. They went into shak, and they were in skepticism. ما لهم به من علم. They had no knowledge except following الظن. وما قتلوه يقينا. They just went into speculation. and they were not sure that they had actually killed him. How did we get into all of that? Let's line a couple things here. All right. I'm going to take a couple lines right there. So they were اختلفوا. They went into shak, ilm, الظن, yaqeen. Those words are really interesting because this is, or these are the terms that in the field of epistemology, it's a field in philosophy, it's a very important field. I think it's as important as studying aqidah. It's extremely important because what it really is taking us in, where in epistemology, what you're trying to study is what makes one particular knowledge credible and what makes one particular or another particular knowledge not credible. How do we define knowing something? What does that even mean? What is the resource that we turn to in defining truth, in defining justice, in defining ethics, in defining information and not delusion? And certainly there would be all these words. How do we know what we're in doubt of? How do we know what we're in complete knowledge of, in certainty? How do we know if this is actually making something as knowledge? How do we know if this is all about skepticism? And this always takes me, whenever I would talk about epistemology and such a science, I would always say, and well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala summarized the words, and he said, إِيَّتَّبِعُونَ إِلَّا الظَّنَّ وَمَا تَهْوَى الْأَنفُسُ وَلَقَدْ جَاءَهُم مِّن رَّبِّهِمُ الْهُدَى. In Surah al-Najm. Is it Najm or al-Qamar? Najm. Or يَتَّبِعُونَ إِلَّا الظَّنَّ. They would only follow al-dhann. They would only follow skepticism. يَتَّبِعُونَ إِلَّا الظَّنَّ. Look at the word يَتَّبِعُون. يَتَّبِع actually means that they're taking one. الاتباع can mean to follow, could also mean to take a certain practice. So they're following, they're taking certain leaders, they're also taking it one step after another. يتبعون الظن, and look at the word يتبعون, there's a shadda on it, which also would mean this gradual steps. There are gradual steps that took them into that speculation, into thinking that, yes, we've got the right answer to this, but the truth of the matter, it is really just upon theory, it is really just a speculation. يتبعون إلا الظن. But then they'll use another resource, وما تهوى الأنفس. They'll use وما تهوى الأنفس. They'll depend on their hawa, on what basically enhances and maximizes their happiness and pleasure. They'll use that as another source. How do we prove something is right or wrong? They'll say, well, let's maximize the level of pleasure. And if it maximizes the level of pleasure, that means it's good. That's اتباع الهوى وما تهوى الأنفس. So what happens? The society would engage either in dhann by saying, we've got the pattern, we can study the pattern, we can study what this leads to, and then, or use maximizing the pleasure as a form or as a source of proving that something is good or something is a credible source of knowledge. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, there's no way. Not speculation and not your maximizing pleasure theory. All of that is not necessarily the way to recognize what is ethical and what is not ethical, because all of that would basically fall within the circle in where اتباع الظن and al-hawa, you yourself as a human being, you cannot be capable of finding and figuring out the purpose that preceded your existence, because you yourself are part of the existence, and therefore the only source for you to know the complete truth and get to certainty is into what? Is through al-wahy, revelation. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically tell us right there, يَتَّبِعُونَ اللَّظَّنَ وَمَا تَهْوَى الْأَنفُسُ وَلَقَدْ جَاءَهُم مِّن رَّبِّهِمُ الْهُدَى. And they actually had been revealed to, of course, guidance, which is al-wahy. And here we go. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was basically telling us, well, in order to understand and not go into different doubts or go into different speculations, and in order to find yaqeen, you would basically need to really depend on the revelation. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala right there says, بَلْ رَفَعَهُ اللَّهُ إِلَيْهِ. As a matter of fact, and the truth of the matter, that the Lord Almighty had ascended him to him, and the Lord Almighty is Aziz and Hakima. Al-Aziz, Al-Hakim. And what that actually takes us, let's go into our little map again, in where, let's see, الصد عن سبيل الله, they were being a barrier against the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they basically had engaged in taking up interest in eating, or the word is eating, but this is not to really mean eat, meaning, eat with your mouth, but this is to consume, to take money, to take the property that doesn't belong onto you. So what does that actually mean? That basically takes us into recognizing that the implication of that, in where the Lord Almighty tells us that that is really leading them into adhab. Al-adhab is basically torments, and it's basically they're making their life harder on them. They're determining, one, to lose the different pleasures. Two, they're determining with such an engagement in dhann, in skepticism, in doubt, in losing the knowledge, they're basically determining that they're basically going to be living in a cycle of doubt, in a cycle of confusion. Let's say, on the other hand, because if we're talking about knowledge, we're talking about certainty, then of course the ayah actually takes us into seeing such a contrast. Let's look at it again. The ayah takes us into seeing such a contrast. Let's take these out and actually see, where does it take us into recognizing other places. Let's see. فَبِظُلْمٍ مِّنَ الَّذِينَ هَادُوا. Here we go. Because of a dhulm that they had committed, basically حَرَّمْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ طَيِّبَاتٍ. They basically had lost a lot of. So this actually takes us into two things. Because of the dhulm that they had committed, حرمنا. Was this tashri'i, or was this also that they had lost natural resources that they could have actually made use of? It means two. It can mean tashri'i, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed a legislature ordering them that they could not consume such items, even though it was actually tayyiba, it was actually good for them. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbid them from using it. And it could also mean that it was something that they themselves, because of the result of their behavior, it's exactly like this. If you don't take your food as medicine, you'll end up taking medicine as food, right? If you don't take your food as medicine, you'll end up taking your medicine as food. In other words, when you don't want to engage in eating right, you're going to end up really having no choice but to, it was really a result of your own action, your own engagement. So what will that result into? That will result in حرمنا عليهم طيبات أحلت لهم. They weren't capable of consuming a lot of good things that would have probably made their life easier. وَبِصَدِّهِمْ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. And because they were distancing people away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what happened? And they were basically engaging not only in distancing people away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but they were also trying to seek different ways. Why did they engage in distancing people away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Well, it's because they were seeking a different type of interest. But this interest is really the interest in where when you give somebody a loan and you start taking the interest on it. This is أخذ الربا. But it was also that they were giving up and letting go of الميثاق الغليظ. They were letting go of that strong bond, the principle of the Lord Almighty, in order to engage in what? In order to increase in personal interest and in order to take away and basically transgress the limit in people's properties. I want you to look at this one. Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Yahud engaged in a number of different wrong behaviors. Why the emphasis on that? Because remember, the whole surah was actually trying to tell you what makes us the foundation of justice is how you first recognize your source. You recognize justice by recognizing that the source is really Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That the Yahud themselves, they basically went into one, not realizing and giving themselves different narratives. They went off from absorbing and embracing the words of al-mithaq al-ghalid, absorbing the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that led them into committing injustices, and that eventually led into not only aqidah injustice in the beginning, but then that led to social and economical and financial injustices as well. But then what happened on the other hand? Remember, such injustices, when you're seeing these patterns, it's really important to realize that it actually started out with the person, with those people actually engaging in dalal. They wanted to go off the world of the Lord Almighty. That resulted in their hearts being sealed, that resulted in the community itself embracing a delusion, that basically resulted in them not finding certainty, going into doubt, that led them into losing a lot of the good things that would have made their life.
I love this map.
Yep.
I love how you mapped it out, mashallah.
They basically lost in finding the different resources to make their life easier, to make their life basically more stable, to give them a better chance of getting more success. So what did they live? They lived in adab alim. In this life and in the hereafter, they basically lived in misery. They lived in hardship. They lived in illnesses. They lived in mental illnesses. They lived in social illnesses. They lived in physical illnesses. They lived in economical instability, and the list goes on. And that's adab alim. Let's see for the other side. Let's look at that right there. In where on the other side, لكن الراسخون في العلم. Who? Minhum. From who? From Ahl al-Kitab. There are rasikhin fil ilm. There are those. The word rasikh, what does it mean? The word rasikh actually means to dig deep in something. So rusukh, I want you to look at the word rusukh, and there is a certain vibe. Ra-sa-kha. Start from the mouth. Ra, the letter Ra starts from the lips, Ra, by rolling your lips, and Kha goes all the way to your throat, because there's no way to be a rasikh unless you start from the beginning and you go dig deep down. Dig deep down. And that's, there's a ilm in Lugha Arabiya, it's actually called fiqh al-lugha. What is fiqh al-lugha? Ibn Faris, he actually looks at the words and looks at the letters, and he tried to understand how did the Arab actually get, and how not only the Arab but the Semites, because Arabic is a Semitic language, how did they actually create?
What
or
was his
even
name?
Ibn
Sorry.
Faris.
Ibn Faris.
Ibn
Okay.
Faris. So what he was trying to figure out, how did the sounds themselves become a way of communication? Why the sound? How did this all begin? What vibe does it give? Of course, if you want to, well, kind of like a child, when the child wants to make a sound, they're either use probably the sound that the maybe if it's water, call it boo, I don't know, boo or something like that, or some sound that he will probably try to mimic, or mama, in where that's easier for them to, they're hearing it, their mama trying to mimic that sound in where what they heard mama say, and it's easier for them to, of course, close their lips, release, close their lips, release. So what Ibn Faris was trying to figure out, how did they get into these words, and what sound can we get in order to know, just by using the vibration, by using the place of articulation, how can we know the meanings of the words? This is really interesting, really intelligent. And that's what he actually got.
Yeah, that's amazing. Mashallah.
It's amazing. It's like, even if you're a foreigner, you could look at the places of articulation and you can get the vibe and what that really means. Anyhow, so the word الراسخون في العلم, الراسخون في العلم, in where ra, sa, kha. I want you to look at that. In where the letter kha is deep inside, ra is really the beginning, in where it took them stage after stage to go really deep in the knowledge. And of course, راسخون في العلم, they were deep in knowledge. From who? From the Yahud. Some of them had such strong knowledge. They would study day and night. They would dig deep in the text. And the believers, what do they get into? يؤمنون بما أنزل إليك. They would believe in what was revealed onto you. Let's go back to our map and actually see the implications of that. Let's see. Al-Iman. They basically were capable of finding hidayah. When they found faith, that basically gave them hidayah, that basically gave them to find the resource to help them know the truth. What did that result in? Yes, it resulted in them finding the source of taking away the different impacts of the wrong behaviors that they might have committed, and they were forgiven. In other words, the implication of some of the misbehaviors, it would basically not affect them, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dismissed certain things. Why? Because they have their resources in place. So what did they engage in? They engaged in different types of dhikr. The different types of dhikr, salah, different types of dhikr, zakah, in where it's a community dhikr, it's an individual dhikr. Notice, compare that to the community, let's call it dis dhikr, in the community dhikr, where they were killing the prophets and the messengers. They were saying qulubuna ghulf. They were basically leaving the practice. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala compared it right there with the mu'mineen, in where they were engaging in salah. They were engaging in, let's call it, communal dhikr, sharing money, etc. What did that result in? That resulted in where they were actually increasing in their knowledge. What? In other words, if you really want to gain وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَيُعَلِّمُكُمُ اللَّهُ, have taqwa and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you the knowledge. There's no way that you're going to get the knowledge. We're not talking about knowledge in medicine and knowledge in mathematics and all of that. We're actually talking about the knowledge in where you know your purpose, you know the foundation of your existence, you know basically how to live reality of the purpose that you were created for and how to put it to get to that reality, to get to that purpose that preceded your existence, how to put those two together in where it's leading you and leading your life into getting the connection. The connection between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically by strengthening that bond and strengthening the bond between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's what will get you into believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and getting to al-ajr al-azim and getting to the magnificent reward. Basically, what is al-ajr al-azim? It's Jannah. It's basically crossing path, all the different scary stations in Yawm al-Qiyamah, in the Ajr al-Azim, even in this life where you're actually finding your stability, you're finding your happiness in this dunya as well. So let's zoom out right there for a little bit. Let's compare that. So for the munafiqeen, what were they doing? Well, they were basically mocking the ayat. The kafirin, they were basically trying to end killing the prophets in the word of truth. What was the behavior? The behavior, they were basically leaving the practice. What was the behavior of al-munafiqeen? Well, they were trying to seek honor elsewhere. They were trying to seek some kind of an interest elsewhere. So what did they do? Well, they basically lost Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They didn't get the izzah from the kafirin, and they didn't get the izzah or the honor or the power from the kafirin. They basically ended up losing it all. So what do we find right there? That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes us into number one, the relationship between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and human beings, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كَلَّمَ اللَّهُ مُوسَى تَكْلِيمًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had spoken to Prophet Musa directly. What was the result? It was bringing glad tidings. The prophets were coming in as a warning. They came in with evidence. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not in need for their submission, but the Lord Almighty is basically most wise, because that is going to basically connect with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put as part of your nature. It is part of your instinct to find the truth. It is part of your instinct to search for certainty. It is part of your instinct to search for the purpose that you were created for. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically told us that He had spoken to him directly. He brought what you're looking for. You're always in seek of maximizing pleasure. Well, here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, well, it was basically brought with the prophets and messengers, the way to help you maximize the pleasure in a way that does not bring in harm to you. And also in order to decreasing the pain. So by warning you, He's basically giving you the ways to decrease pain, increase and maximize pleasure in where it does not contradict maximizing the pain. And certainly there were evidences in order to support the argument and give you certainty and give you basically the revelation and give you the source of knowledge. And certainly those that would reject the faith, they would basically, one, find themselves distant. They would be distancing others. They would find themselves distant away from even finding the guidance. Then they would basically find themselves living in rejection, living in negativity. They're rejecting everything in life, not even realizing the blessings that they were living in. And certainly they would find themselves living a life, mental illness after mental illness, physical illness, and the list goes on, social illnesses, all of that. That's what will get them into oppression and injustice, in where on Judgment Day, they're not forgiven. And what they will be living in is basically darkness as the implication of that sin, that misbehavior. Why? Well, they cannot find guidance unless they would relate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's no way, there's no source of guidance but through al-wahy, but through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because if the person is not finding guidance, they're living in the loss, emptiness, with no purpose, and what they're really getting lost into is really living in a delusion, and that delusion basically takes them away. That delusion basically takes them away from finding the resources, from finding the truth, and from engaging in the application. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically tells us, in order to understand justice, in order to understand what makes ethics, what makes morality, it is really in order, and not in any way but into connecting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and finding it through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So basically, the basis of truth is al-wahy. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent the prophets with the truth, and faith is basically is better in its core, and the implication, of course, of faith is going to be bringing us the stability, and bringing us basically what will bring us happiness in this dunya and in the akhirah. And truth is based off knowing and understanding that everything is a creature by the power of the creator. And therefore your mind, although it has some power to help you figure out a lot of different tools to knowing the truth, but it basically cannot know the ultimate and the complete truth by using your own, let's say, mind alone. Because the truth of the matter is that some truth is only going to be as a way that is revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that your mind is limited to knowing all the truth about everything. Therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically tells us right there that the truth is basically by the power of the Lord Almighty. So knowing the truth about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is the creator and not a creature. Your mind was designed to investigate, to scrutinize, to study things that are materialistic, not things that are beyond materialistic things, not things that are beyond matter. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that therefore that He is beyond matter. Therefore, to think that by using science that you're going to get to somehow investigating, or somehow you're going to get to finding God under a microscope, you've got it all wrong. The Lord Almighty is not matter. The Lord Almighty is beyond matter. Therefore, knowledge and wisdom is predetermined, predestined by its correlation with the purpose that preceded your existence. So in order to consider what makes knowledge, what makes guidance, it really must be something that is coming in correlation and connected with the actual purpose that preceded your existence. So when we're speaking about knowledge, in order to know something, it's not enough to know how things function, but you also need to know why everything in life was actually designed in a certain way. Where is it heading? What am I supposed to be heading to? What is the purpose of my existence? And certainly all of that was predetermined. It was predestined before you were even created, before life was created. Therefore, to really know the intention behind all of this is only to be by getting a revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because all of that preceded your existence and preceded life itself. Let's see, there's inshallah, tomorrow we'll stop right here because I know it was a lot of information. We'll go in details inshallah with the tafsir of these ayat from Tafsir al-Qurtubi inshallah, in order to connect these dots together, because this one was more of, I would say, more of a prelude in order to go in detail, because we need to look at these words and see the correlation of what the words are really trying to send us, and what they were trying to basically enlighten us with. And of course, we need to go down in more details in order to figure all that out, inshallah, tomorrow. So here's a question. If a person forbids marriage on himself to get out of fitna, is it haram to do that? Keep in mind, firstly, he tried hard to get married, but due to some issues, he couldn't. So marriage actually falls within different categories, with all the different 5 categories of الحكم, with 5 different rulings. Marriage can be haram, marriage can be halal, marriage can be obligatory, and marriage can be makruh. So it really depends on the person. All right. If the person knows that they are not capable of applying the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in terms of being just in marriage, then in that situation, marriage becomes haram on that person. If the person, they basically fear that they've got the resources to implementing the responsibilities and the rights and responsibilities in marriage, they have the resources, they know they're capable of doing it, and they're worried that they might actually fall in fitna, then in that situation, marriage would be mandatory. It would be fard on them. If the person, well, I mean, I'm not really falling in fitna, I've got talab al-ilm, I've got all of that, in that situation, it would be a sunnah to get married. All right. And number 4, basically mubah. It is permissible to get married. If you want to get married, you don't have to get married if that's not something that is for you. All right. If you feel that, no, I can engage in a better action, I can engage in something better, etc. I want to, marriage is not necessarily for everybody. So if it's not something that suits you in your, number 1, probably your ability to apply the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, meaning the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And yeah, I'm okay with it. I'm not necessarily somebody that would really want to get married, for example. I'm not somebody that is really into that. It's mubah. It's permissible if you don't want to, and you would rather just live a life of probably getting a job, taking care of your parents, etc. Well, okay, it's mubah, it's permissible, but if that's not something that interests you, that's permissible. So is it a delusion? No, it depends on the person's circumstances. It's not necessary. But for those that want to deter people away from marriage and basically let them get into fitna, then that would definitely be a delusion. That would be a form. When we speak about delusion, we're speaking about engaging or let's say encouraging others to embrace other than the rulings, or let's say the description that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had described certain things in. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described certain things, halal, haram. A delusion would be if you were to not describe it as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described it. That's a delusion. In other words, you're letting your own mind see a matter that was described by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as something else, but you created your own narrative. You created a wrong vision. You were in an optical vision or a mental delusion in where you thought something was in a certain way, but the truth of the matter is that you would really have to go back to Quran and Sunnah to help you see the realities of the matter, and not a delusion within your mind thinking that things are in such a way. Let's see. Does this apply to both means, man and woman? So yes, absolutely. الحكم الشرعي, the ruling on a man and a woman in terms of marriage, it's the same for a man and a woman. A woman, it could be haram for her to get married if she cannot fulfill the responsibilities, and it could be halal. It could depends on the situation. So yes, it applies on to man and woman. If there are any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them, inshallah. You can unmute yourselves if you wanted to. So this is it. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Mama.
Can you share? Is that a shareable link? Maybe that for
You mean
or maybe for next time, just to have that the document link
this
for
one?
the attendees. Yeah. I don't know if you can.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I could do that. It's
Maybe
just
next time. Maybe next time.
yeah,
Inshallah.
inshallah. All right,
Jazakallah.
inshallah. وإياكم. So, and inshallah, we'll see you all tomorrow and go in detail, inshallah, in the tafsir. And assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
We sure missed it. Wa alaikum salam rahmatullahi wa
Allah
barakatuh.
yahfadak ya Rabbi. Allah yabarak.
Walaikum salam rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Noora, did you change your name?
Oh, I'm you know, I'm the
Yes.
admin for Gems of Light, so sometimes I come under one of the instructors' accounts by accident.
That's why I don't find you there. Jazakallah khair, Dr. Aysha.
Allah yahfadk
Jazakallah
ya Rabbi jami'an. Barakallahu feekum.
Allah give you jazaa in dunya and akhirah.